This video covers Module 3, Part A, Sampling. In this video, I'll talk through how to go about selecting a sample for a research study. I'll differentiate it from what we do when we conduct a census and go through a range of techniques that fall into the two broad classifications of probability sampling and non-probability sampling. It's important to understand that distinction. So what is sampling? We say this refers to the process of taking some subset of a larger population or from some larger group. What we ultimately want to do is find out or be able to infer something about the wider population, but it doesn't always make sense to collect information from everyone in the population. Sometimes it's too costly or they're simply not accessible. So instead what we do is draw a subset or a sample. We analyze that sample and draw conclusions about it to infer something about the wider population. In order to do that, one of the big considerations we need to make is how to obtain a representative sample, a sample that's representative of the wider population so that we can trust those conclusions are accurate and therefore rely on those inferences that we make. Some terminology to be aware of is listed here. We've got population, sample, and element, and be familiar with each of these terms in this type of sense or research setting, because I'll be using them fairly consistently throughout the remainder of the unit. We've got the term population, which simply refers to the entire group of things or the entire group of people that we're interested in for our research purposes. It doesn't necessarily mean the population of Australia. It means the population of interest in our study. If we're interested in the sleep habits of AMB 201 students, then our population of interest is AMB 201 students. It's just that group that's relevant to us. A sample, as I said before, is the subset or a subset that we're going to use for our research purposes that comes from that population. And then an element is the individual member from our sample from whom we draw information. So it's the lowest level of our sample, the individual that we get that information from. It's quite important to be aware of the distinction here from what we term a census. When we collect information from every element or every member of the population, we're not sampling per se. What we're doing is conducting a census. Most people tend to think of that word census as relating to the national census as carried out by the Australian Bureau of Statistics in Australia every few years, but it actually refers to whenever we measure the attribute within everyone within any particular population, when that population is the only thing we're interested in our study. So as I said before, if I were interested in the sleep habits of AMB 201 students and I measured that attribute of everyone within the sleep habits of everyone within AMB 201, I'd actually be conducting what we term a census. Something like a national census is extremely costly, and you can imagine takes considerable time, and it's quite a massive undertaking. So a national census is very rare in something like market research. Instead, it's carried out by larger statistical bodies. When a census can be conducted, however, the information that we can get or the statistics that we can get from that census become very reliable, very trustworthy, provided we can assume that respondents have given accurate information. So for example, we don't have to make estimates of something like the average income or the average rental payments that people make in the Australian population. We can look at the actual figures, and we know that these figures are going to be accurate because we've measured that characteristic in everyone. So you can see here, for example, the ABS has given the population of Australia down to the exact individual person, so 23,401,892 people are living in Australia, and they can say that the median age is 38. The average number of children per household is listed here. You can see the median monthly mortgage repayments down to the dollar, and we can assume that that's accurate because they've measured that in everyone in the population. When we gather information from a sample of people through something like a survey, we don't necessarily have that exact level of accuracy, but what we want to do is ensure we've got a representative sample so that we can provide a relatively good estimate for those sorts of things. It's not always going to be perfect, but provided we've got a good representative sample, then usually it can be quite accurate. Why would we sample instead of conducting a census? Well, obviously we don't always have access to everyone within our population, and gathering information from a sample is going to be more cost effective. It doesn't take as much money because you're accessing only a smaller group of people. It doesn't take as long to do it. It can also be quite sufficient provided you do have a representative sample, because we know statistically if you do have a good sample that the estimates you can get from that will be really quite comparable to if you were to measure that characteristic in the wider population. When you have a homogeneous population, so the population is identical on the attribute, obviously we don't need to measure the attribute in everyone. We only need a very small sample, or even a sample of one. A good example of that you'd be able to think about is if you were doing a taste test of wine or a taste test of beer. You're essentially tasting a sample of that beer in order to understand how the entire keg or how the entire bottle will taste. You don't need to drink the entire keg to know how it tastes because it's a relatively homogeneous product. In some instances, a sample can also be better, because when we conduct a census and get information from everyone, what that means is we also gather information from people who don't want to take part or who aren't motivated to take part, and therefore can be a little bit careless with their responses. So responses can start to be a little bit inaccurate, and some people will even falsify their responses. That's a common thing that is reported in census data or national census data, with people falsifying their responses, giving bogus responses to religion questions, for example. You also got the issue with a census where, because you're handling so much information, there is also more scope for error in terms of administrative error. People can code up information incorrectly if they're having to enter thousands or hundreds of thousands of sheets of data. You as a researcher can start to fatigue and start to code things slightly differently. So if you're just doing that on a smaller subset of people, often that can be a little bit better in that sense. So a census, while deemed a little bit more reliable when it's done well, isn't always ideal. Sometimes collecting information from a sample of people through a survey is seen as just as valid and sometimes better. We also have to collect a sample rather than conduct a census if our procedure results in destruction of our elements. So for example, think about crash testing vehicles, or if Toyota were to try to determine how safe its Toyota Camry hybrids were. Right? They don't want to crash test all of their vehicles and then say, yes, we've got a 99% rating in terms of accuracy. They probably only want to crash test a few of those because they want some left over to sell. So anytime our research procedure destroys elements, obviously we want to only conduct that research with a sample. Same thing with old growth forests. You don't want to cut down the entire forest in order to say, yes, our trees were 1,000 years old, because then you have no forest left. You've also got an issue with conducting a census in terms of things like policy evaluations or public policy debate, where sometimes the very act of conducting a census and letting people know that this is going to happen can bias responses. So it can result in additional lobbying from other parties to try to get indifferent people to take a position that they wouldn't necessarily hold. And if earlier samples or earlier surveys have indicated very clear trends, it also makes that ultimate census entirely unnecessary. And this is what the government was criticised for in recent years when they tried to conduct a plebiscite on same-sex marriage. The criticism was that we already know that people are strongly in favour of it, and that positive attitude towards it is increasing because there have been dozens and dozens and dozens of surveys showing that trend across a number of years. So we can assume that that's going to be somewhat reliable. The idea there also was that once that plebiscite is declared, you're going to get lobby groups trying to bias those people who are necessarily a little bit undecided, and that can therefore influence results. So in that sense, a sample survey is going to be more reliable and probably more ethical to conduct than would a census be. So what I want to do for the remainder of this video is go through a 7-stage model of how to select a sample. We use these types of staged models in order to ensure what we do is methodical, systematic, and rigorous, so that we know that we're doing this part or this component of the research in a reliable and trustworthy way. But it's also important that we follow these steps so that other people can come back and critique what we've done, question what we've done, or replicate what we've done. So it's very important to follow these steps. So stage one of sampling is always to define your target population, and this is to give very clear, precise descriptions of who our research is targeting or who our research is focusing on, and where we're drawing our people from or where we're drawing our samples from. So a lot of researchers will give fairly vague descriptions of their target population. So you might say, we're interested in young male gamers, for example, people who play games online. But it actually becomes a lot more helpful for you as a researcher, and also for readers of your research, the more detail you give, or the more precision you give in your target population definition. So rather than just saying we're interested in young male gamers, you might come back and say we're interested in 18 to 25-year-old males who live in Queensland, who report being online for more than 4 hours per day, and who played a game or reported playing a game during the month of December. So it becomes much more precise. Readers of your research can see exactly who you're talking about, how you went about collecting your sample, and then who your findings are going to be applicable to. When you provide a very precise definition that describes how you went about defining or operationalizing your population, what we say is you're providing an operational definition. You're describing in practical terms how you've gone about operationalizing that idea or that concept that you're interested in. A good illustration of a research company or a research firm that provides nice operational definitions of their target population is in this infographic here by Global Web Index. You will have seen from when you were looking at infographics for your qualitative report that often a lot of detail isn't provided in them regarding who the target population was, or where the sample came from, or the number of people within the sample. And that's why, as part of the project requirements for your infographic, I've asked that you include details of your sample, the type of analysis that was used, and so forth. You can see a good illustration of that here, where Global Web Index has this infographic that is reporting on what they term on-the-go consumers and their likelihood to consume entertainment content via mobile devices. So they're talking about on-the-go consumers being people who are regular exercisers and users of public transport. So they're fairly vague general descriptions of a target population, but you can see they're asterisked here, and if we go down to asterisk notes down the bottom here, you can see that they're describing regular users as online adults who exercise 2 to 3 times a week or more, and users of public transport as online adults who use public transport more than once a week. So they're really getting down to that level of detail that we know exactly who they're talking about. If we look a little bit further here, they describe their base sample as those two groups, and they restrict it to those aged 16 to 64. I guess that's fairly broad, but at least they're giving that age range so we know who their sample is. We understand who their target population is and who their sample was. So that's a really good example of where that becomes quite handy. As I said, it's not always, that level of detail isn't always provided in infographics, but it's very handy to do that, and I'd really recommend that when you're constructing your infographic for your next report that you consider that kind of detail. Stage 2 then is thinking about your sampling frame, or the group within that target population from whom you're going to draw your sample. So you might be interested in 18 to 25-year-old male gamers from Queensland, but realistically you don't have access to all 18 to 25-year-old male gamers in Queensland. You might have access to a mailing list, or you might have access to a list of people that you've created based on your interactions with people that you're going to draw your sample from. Those lists, those emailing lists, or that list of people would represent your sampling frame. We term our sampling frame an operational population, the population from whom we're actually going to draw our sample. You can think about your target population as the theoretical population or the theoretical pool that you're going to draw your sample from, but then your sampling frame is a subset of that, which we say is the practical or realistic pool that we're going to draw from. If we think about marketing research, that term sampling frame seems a little bit obscure, a little bit abstract. Why is it termed a frame? If you think about where that comes from or the origin of that term, it starts to make a little bit more sense. So you can think about the physical sciences, where these physical frames are laid out over a geographic area or over a physical area, and then the researcher selects their sample from within that frame. So that's where that term sampling frame comes from. Obviously, placement of that frame is key. You want that frame to be placed in a fairly representative area or based on a fairly representative group of people, so that when we draw our sample is also representative. Within marketing, we don't necessarily lay out physical frames around people, but we can use that concept to think about how we select our sample. So for example, if you're interested in fashion purchasing in Queensland, you might say that your sampling frame is the Queen Street Mall. And so essentially you're laying out your sampling frame and then drawing your sample from that. Something like a phone book can represent a sampling frame. Something like a mailing list can represent a sampling frame, where we've got a list of all people that we're going to potentially include in our sample. Once we've identified our sampling frame, we can start to think about how we're going to actually draw our samples. There are two broad classifications available to us. We call these probability sampling and non-probability sampling techniques. And I'll go through these in a fair bit of detail because there are a few different ones available, and it's important to be aware of the distinction. So, as a broad description, we say that probability sampling techniques are a group of techniques where every element within our target population or every element within our sampling frame has some probability of being selected, and it involves a component of random selection. Non-probability sampling, in contrast, is where there are some elements of our target population or some elements of our sampling frame who have zero probability of being selected, and there is no element of or component of random selection. So it might sound a little bit vague, so I'll explain that in a little bit more detail. If I were interested in something like healthy eating habits of people within AMB 201, and I went along to one of the AMB 201 tutorials and selected a sample of 20 people and measured their eating habits, that would be an example of non-probability sampling, because people who weren't in that tutorial or people who didn't come along to the tutorial have zero probability of being in my sample. If, however, I placed all AMB 201 students' names into a hat and drew out 20 of them, every single person had a chance of being selected into my sample. So this is more likely to be a probability sampling technique. So just be familiar with the distinction between those two. Non-probability sampling is where some people or some elements have zero probability, zero chance of being selected into the sample. With probability sampling, everyone has some chance of being selected into the sample, and there's an element of random selection. Now, before talking about the different types of sampling techniques that fall into each of these two classifications, I want to spend a moment talking about this term random or random selection, because that's really the essence of why probability sampling is a valuable approach to sampling within any research design. Having random selection really removes the researcher's own bias in selecting certain people into the sample. So in a statistical sense, what we mean when we say random selection is that each element of our sampling frame or each element of our target population has the exact same chance of being selected into our sample. The researcher's bias is removed. It doesn't matter if the researcher finds certain people friendly, others unfriendly, has a preference for people from certain occupational groups or people from certain cultural groups. All of that is irrelevant. If someone is included within our sampling frame, then they have an equal chance of being selected into our sample as anyone else. That's really a little bit different to the way this term random is commonly used in everyday language, or has started to be used in colloquial language. If you think about the way it gets used, often people use this term random in everyday language to refer to something that's a little bit unexpected or unusual, or that doesn't follow the general pattern. So you might say you spoke to a random person on the street, or you danced with a random person in a nightclub, and I'm sure you can think of other examples of use of that term, and people really refer to that or use that in the sense that they didn't expect that outcome, or they didn't really put a lot of thought into that outcome. Statistically, that's only part of the story. When we're thinking about random selection or randomness in a statistical sense, what we're saying is that every instance has the exact same chance of happening. So it doesn't matter if something is familiar to you or unfamiliar to you, expected or unexpected, it has the same chance of happening. So if you're saying that you danced with a random person in a nightclub, what you're actually saying is every single person in that nightclub had the same chance of dancing with you. So those people who you knew and those people who you didn't know, they all had the same chance of being your dance partner. It's not just the unexpected ones. So in order to have random selection, what we need to know is who's in our sampling frame or who's in our target population. We need to ensure that they have the same chance of being selected. Sometimes that involves putting names into a hat, or in the illustration here, balls into a barrel, or it might involve flipping a coin where either side has the same chance of coming up. Often it involves a computer program randomly selecting who goes into the sample and who doesn't go into the sample, but everyone within the sampling frame has the same chance of being selected. Anytime people introduce their own personal bias into selection, then that selection is no longer random. You can remember back, if you think back to your qualitative research project where you chose your interview participant, you probably chose someone who you knew, or you probably chose someone who engaged in the type of behavior you were interested in. You chose someone based on your knowledge. So that wasn't random selection because you introduced your own bias. If ideally we want to select people at random because we don't want our own bias coming into play, then what we need to know is who exactly is in our target population or who is in our sampling frame. We need to be able to list those people out in order to ensure no one misses out. Everyone has the same chance of being selected. So really what we need to know is, in our sampling frame, can we get a full list of people and then randomly select people into our sample. So I'll go through 4 different probability sampling techniques and 4 non-probability sampling techniques to give you an idea of the variety of techniques available to us and how they each start to build on or cater to potential downsides of other techniques. The first one to be aware of is simple random sampling, and this is the basis of a lot of the other techniques, so be familiar with this one. Simple random sampling is similar to putting all the names of everyone within your target population into a hat and then drawing out a certain number to represent your sample. It's the basic idea of random selection. It removes researcher bias, and if we draw a large enough sample, it's going to give us likely a fairly representative sample. If our sample is too small, however, then there's a good chance that despite using random sampling or simple random sampling, our sample won't be representative. So if we've got, say, 200 people, such as depicted in this class here, and I guess that's around 200 people, and we draw out a sample of 5 people, chances are that won't be representative. We might get just 5 older people, or we might by chance just get 5 guys. We know that that's not representative because we know there are older and younger people in that group. But just by chance, we're not getting a representative sample. Really what we need to do is draw a larger sample. And I've got an illustration of that you can use yourself if you'd like to see how small samples don't necessarily produce representative samples. So I found this randomizer or random number generator online, and it's just at randomizer.org, and I'm going to generate a few different samples of 5 numbers. So I'm going to generate, say, 10 different samples, each with 5 numbers. I want those numbers to range from 1 to 500. Right, and we're going to say that we want those numbers to be sorted from least to greatest. If I generate those 5 numbers, what you can see here is in our first set, we've got 2 numbers in the first group of 100. We don't have any numbers represented in that 300 group. Down here, our first 3 numbers are in the first 300. We don't have any one represented in the 200 group, and so forth. So these numbers are not necessarily representative of the full range of numbers. Down here, you can see the 10th set, none of the numbers go past 224 despite a sampling from 500. So we've got essentially half of that number range missing out of being included in the sample. The way you'd go about making sure that was somewhat representative is maybe increase your sample size to ensure you do get numbers across the full spectrum if you wanted to use that simple random sampling approach. But just be aware that despite using simple random sampling, you're not necessarily always going to get a representative sample. An alternative to that is what we call systematic sampling. So if we want to ensure that we get the elements across the full range of our population, what we can do is select a random starting point and then take every 10th person from that starting point, or every 4th person from that starting point, depending on the number that we wanted. So we might take this person and then the next 10th person and the next 10th person and the next 10th person and so on, and that way you're getting a sample that spans that full population. One of the problems with doing that though is if your population is ordered in some systematic way, perhaps every 10th instance represents something that's a little bit biased. We often see this type of approach used by people for mall intercept surveys, where someone stopping people on the street will stop every 10th person. They won't stop every single person, and in theory that's getting a broad spectrum of everyone that they pass rather than just certain people. If you've been through security at an airport, what you'll see is that the person doing the pat downs or the person doing the security check at the end of the security line is often choosing a person based on X number, or every kth person. They might choose every 10th person. So despite looking a little bit suspicious, they might not look at you, they might look beyond you because you're not the 10th person necessarily, or the 8th person, or whatever number that they're choosing. We do have this issue that I mentioned though called periodicity, where if our underlying population is structured in some way, then it's possible that by using systematic sampling we're going to get a biased sample. So for example, if we were sampling houses along a street, we know odd numbers are typically on one side of a street, even numbers are on the other, and we were to sample say every 4th person or every 6th person, then we would only get people on one side of the street, which would not necessarily give us an unbiased sample. So that can be a bit of an issue and something that we have to think about. Perhaps you'd want to use an odd number rather than an even number. Stratified sampling is the other approach, or is another approach where we want to ensure that we get full representativeness across our population within our sample. So if we know within our population that we've got a fairly even split of men and women, we've got a full range of ages, what we perhaps want to do is say, okay, we want to ensure that 50% of our sample is men and 50% is women, so that we get representative of both. So what you would do is break your population up into strata, or into a stratum, being singular for strata, and then draw a simple random sample from each of those. So you draw a simple random sample of girls and a simple random sample of guys. One of the difficulties with stratified sampling is choosing what the way in which to break your population up. So it may be that gender is one way you could split the population, but actually you should be splitting it up based on age group, or you should be splitting it up based on cultural background or something like that. So it's up to you as a researcher to choose that, and that might not always be the right way to go about it. Cluster sampling is the 4th one to be aware of, and this is a little bit like stratified sampling, but takes advantage of the notion that the way people live geographically tends to be in clusters. So people from ethnic backgrounds tend to live in clusters together. People from similar socioeconomic demographics tend to live in clusters together. So richer people tend to cluster in certain suburbs, poorer people in other suburbs. So cluster sampling takes advantage of that idea, and what you would do in cluster sampling is take a random sample of clusters. Often it's based on suburbs or something similar to suburbs, and then a random sample within each of those chosen suburbs. A downside of it is that you might miss out on valuable information by not selecting certain other clusters. So that's always a little bit of a challenge. In terms of non-probability sampling, this is where we say that some people have zero chance of being selected. So as I go through these, think about why there is zero chance of being selected for some people. And this is also where there's no random selection. The first one to be aware of is convenience sampling, and this kind of underlies the other non-probability sampling approaches. So convenience sampling is where the researcher simply chooses those people who are easiest to access to them, who are convenient for them to survey or to recruit into their study. It's seen as really quite valuable in that it's low cost and easy to do. You go out and you sample your friends, or you go out on the street and you ask people walking past to fill out your survey or whatever. But the problem with convenience sampling is that because we're selecting those people who are convenient to us, often that doesn't produce a representative sample, and then the resulting studies can have findings that don't necessarily generalize. So you would have found this when you were recruiting or looking at the participants who took part in the qualitative studies. Most people tended to be younger, around the age group of the researchers. Most people tended to live in Brisbane. Most people were friends or family of the student researchers collecting that data. So we don't necessarily know that those findings would generalize to the wider population. So a good example of convenience sampling with that. And there's a depiction there where we're saying the researcher is essentially just picking those people close to them. The second type of non-probability sampling is what we term purposive sampling, or judgmental sampling is the other term for this. And this is a type of convenience sampling, but it's where the researcher will go out with specific criteria in mind and look for those people convenient to them who meet that criterion. So it might be that you're interested in people who are online gamers, so you go out walking around the street, or you go out walking around campus looking for people playing games on their smartphone or on a tablet computer. Or you might be interested in people over the age of 40, so you go out and you look for people who appear to be older than 40 to recruit in your sample. The downside of this type of sampling approach is that it's heavily reliant on the researcher identifying those people, and people tend to recruit people into their sample who display very obvious instances of this behavior, right? So if you're looking for people over the age of 40, probably you're going to approach people who definitely look over 40 rather than get the full spectrum of people over than 40. If you were running a study and wanted to recruit pregnant women and you were using purposive sampling, you wouldn't necessarily want to approach someone who maybe looked pregnant, maybe didn't look pregnant, and say, hey, I'm running a study on pregnant women. What you would do instead is pick someone who looked very pregnant. So what we can get is underrepresentativeness of the full spectrum of that behavior when we do that. Snowball sampling is one that people tend to be quite familiar with. It's also termed referral sampling. So this is where we might access a certain type of participant. It might be an online gamer, for example, and we then ask them to refer on friends who are also online gamers, and that allows us to build our sample. It can be a really useful technique in order to reach hard to get at populations, or hard to identify populations, where online gamers might know other online gamers, but you might not know a lot of online gamers or be able to access them. It can be useful with sensitive populations, so drug addicts, for example. They tend to know each other, but you might not be able to recruit a broad range of them otherwise. People with gambling behaviors, people who engage in tax evasion, that sort of thing. Those people know each other, so they can refer others on. One of the downsides of snowball sampling is that while you tend to be able to generate a sample, what can happen is that those people tend to be similar to each other in other ways. So people tend to be friends with people who are similar to themselves. So taking that online gamer example, or someone with, say, addictive gaming habits, they might know other people, but they tend to be other people who play the same games as them, or people who are similar in personality to them. So again, you miss out on that full representativeness, or that broad spectrum of people who engage in that behavior. And then quota sampling is the final one. And this is very relevant for your quantitative report. This is the type of technique you're going to be using for your quantitative report. This is a lot like stratified sampling, where you know the overall population is represented or composed of these distinct categories of people, and we want to ensure each of those categories is present within our sample. But unlike stratified sampling, what we do with quota sampling is we take a convenience sample within each of those categories. We don't take a simple random sample. So we break the population up into those categories and then recruit X number of people from each of those groups. It might be that we recruit 2 men and 2 women, 2 older people, 2 younger people, 2 people born in Australia, 2 people born outside of Australia, or whatever the criteria are that we're looking for. In terms of the advantages and disadvantages of each of those broad classifications, so probability sampling and non-probability sampling, what tends to be an advantage of one becomes a disadvantage of the other. So for example, we say with probability sampling, because it uses component of random sampling, it's much less prone to researcher bias. So if we're ensuring that everyone in our target population or sampling frame has the same chance of being selected, then researcher bias doesn't come into play. The problem with that is that it does require you to have a full list of elements within our population. And you can imagine that's not always possible. If I've requested that you recruit people who are friends and family to take part in your study, having a complete list of all your friends and family is almost impossible to create. So it can be quite difficult to always execute probability sampling. It's time consuming and it can be costly. The flip side then is non-probability sampling, which is less costly, much more easy to do, but it creates a lot of risk of bias. So if we're not recruiting based on random sampling, if we're recruiting based on convenience, then what can often happen is that the results simply aren't generalizable, or they can be criticized for not being generalizable. For example, you've only recruited people close to you. That isn't necessarily representative of the wider population. And if you remember back to the start of the lecture, what I said is that it's very important to have a representative sample. So it's a real trade-off between these two different approaches, and often it comes back to what is practically possible for you to do, and then you do the best with what you've got. Once you've identified which approach you're going to use, you start to think about the nuances of that, or how you're going to execute that in order to minimize some of that bias and minimize some of that error that's possible. So if you're using phone selection, how can we ensure that we get a full range of people? How are we going to address people who aren't necessarily at home during the time of day that we call? Are we going to call at night and also of a daytime? If we're using a mall intercept approach, or we want to recruit within a sampling frame like the Queen Street Mall, do we want to ensure that we sample from each end of the mall and each side of the mall, so north, west, east and south? Should we recruit both in the morning and the afternoon? How are we going to limit that sort of bias? All of these things need to be taken into account. We do that after we've decided on what sampling approach to use. We need to think about our sample size, and I've mentioned earlier in this lecture, but also in previous lectures, that sample size is very important, and obviously that plays into this idea of getting a random sample so that we can get reliable results. What we typically say is that a larger sample is better, but that's not always practical because we don't always have the resources to create a large sample. Sample size is important up to an extent. After a certain numbers, extra doesn't play a whole lot of or give a whole lot of extra benefit. So it's valuable up until some point. It's often dictated by our resourcing constraints of how much money have we got to recruit for people, and how accessible are people. We often have to build in things like how many people we expect to complete our survey based on how many we send it out to, so non-response becomes important. We can use, and what most researchers tend to do, is use sample sizes based on past studies or their experience with what is the the number that's large enough to demonstrate an effect if an effect is there. There's also algorithms or formula that you can use, and these are called power formula, that will tell you the exact number of people you require in your sample in order to find an effect if one is present. These are a little bit difficult though, because they're quite circular. In order to know the numbers to put in or the parameters to put into the formula, you have to know something about that phenomenon already, and often if you're going in and researching something that you don't know too much about, that's not always possible. So often the best guide for it is past experience and what has been used in past studies. You need to go out and actually decide who's going to be in your sample. So often if you're using a very staged approach, so you're selecting homes across the state and then people within those homes, you can come back and do a little bit of analysis to make sure you're still going to get a representative sample. When we did our unit pricing study that I talked about in the experimental lecture, what we did was actually recruit a bunch of people that would then map them out graphically across Queensland to see that we were getting clustering in places that were more densely populated and lack of clustering in places that weren't, to ensure we had a good representation. Had we got a strong clustering in somewhere that's not very populated, say Mount Isa relative to Brisbane, then we'd know that we didn't have a representative sample, and we'd perhaps have to come back and revisit the way we were collecting data. You can also come back and look at the distribution that you've got within your sample relative to established characteristics within the wider population. So here I've got data from the panel that's available from the online research unit consumer panel relative to data from the Australian Bureau of Statistics in terms of how many are male versus female compared to that in the wider population, how many people are present within each of the different geographic locations around Australia compared to the number of people we'd expect to be living in those places around Australia. You can see this is really quite comparable, therefore the online research unit consumer panel is probably fairly representative, and you can see also with these age groups it's still very representative. And then once you've determined that you've got a representative sample, you can actually administer your survey or ask your questions and collect data, and that's exactly what you'll be doing with your quantitative report, so you'll have lots of fun with that. So that's essentially what I wanted to cover in this lecture. So we've talked about sampling and the different techniques available to us, and made this distinction clear between probability and non-probability sampling. In the next lecture we'll be talking about measurement, which really comes back to thinking about the types of questions that we're going to ask in a survey and the types of response options we should give people in order to get the data that we're after.